I took care of my ex-husband's mother, and after her passing, I inherited everything. Now he and his new lover are threatening to sue me. My name is Claire. I'm 28, and I have a daughter named Cora. She's 6. I never thought I'd share this with strangers, but it's becoming unbearable to keep it all bottled up. More than anything, I just want to understand, was I really so wrong? I was married to Edward for almost 8 years. We met back in college, started dating a year later. Back then, I truly believed I had found the one. He was attentive, funny, supportive, caring. After we got married, we moved into his mother's house, Mrs. Margaret, in a small town up north. It was an old family home, passed down from his late father, who died a few years before our wedding. Life was modest but peaceful. A couple of years in, our daughter Cora was born, our little joy. I'd struggled with infertility, so when I found out I was pregnant again, it felt like a miracle. I was 2 months along when I started noticing Edward pulling away. He worked late, checked his phone constantly, and stepped out to talk on the phone at night. I didn't want to pry. I blamed work, stress, anything else. But deep down, I knew something was off. One night, he left his phone on the couch and went to shower. I couldn't resist. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I still remember how cold I felt reading those texts. He was messaging someone named Haley, his coworker. No room for excuses. Just a string of love notes, messages about their future, and a photo of a positive pregnancy test. My head was spinning. When he came out of the bathroom, I was already crying. I showed him the screen and asked for an explanation. He looked at it, then at me, and after a long pause said, "Yes, Haley's pregnant. I didn't want you to find out like this, but now you know." I couldn't believe this was my reality. I don't remember what I screamed, but I remember how my chest turned numb, like time stopped. A week later, I ended up in the hospital. The doctors said I'd miscarried. They tried to comfort me, told me it wasn't my fault. But I blamed myself for everything. For not being a good enough wife, for not seeing the signs, for not holding it all together. It made no sense, but my brain couldn't let it go. And him? He didn't stay. He didn't even visit. Not that day, not later. He just left, for Haley and their future baby. He even blamed me for bringing it on myself. I couldn't believe I had once loved this man. During all this, Margaret, my mother-in-law, stood by me. We'd always gotten along, but I never expected her to take my side. She came to the hospital, stayed overnight, and then stayed for good. "You're my family," she said. And he made his choice. I felt awkward accepting her help, but she insisted. Then came the ugly divorce. Edward fought hard against paying child support, accused me of manipulation, but the court ordered him to pay, and that was the end of his role in Cora's life. He completely gave up custody, never visited, never asked about her. Just disappeared. No calls, no texts, nothing. And strangely, that's when Margaret truly became our anchor. With each passing day, Margaret became more and more a part of our lives. It was as if she had found new meaning in life, taking care of Cora and helping me manage the everyday things I no longer had the energy for. She woke up earlier than everyone, made breakfast, ironed Cora's school clothes, and told her bedtime stories. I never asked her to give so much of herself, but I couldn't stop her either. She did it all with genuine love. Sometimes I caught myself thinking she had shown more warmth and care than Edward ever had. I was still fighting an inner battle with guilt over our broken family, even though the facts were staring me in the face. It felt like I'd lost a war I didn't even know I was fighting. A few months after the divorce, I found out Haley had given birth to a son. Edward's relatives, his uncle, some cousins, distant aunts, started actively engaging with him again, congratulating him, sharing pictures of the baby. But not a single one of them ever asked how I was doing, or how Cora was, or what our life looked like. It was as if we had been erased, deleted. The only person who still treated us like family was Margaret, and more often she would say, "You're my only real family now." I knew things were tense between her and the rest of the family. After Edward's affair, they stopped inviting her to family events. It was too uncomfortable that she'd taken the side of the ex. And when she refused to attend anything where Edward and Haley would be present, they just began ignoring her altogether. It made me angry. I couldn't understand how they could turn their backs on a woman who had always been their support system. Over time, Margaret's health began to decline. She complained of pain in her legs, then started struggling to walk, and eventually barely moved at all. I offered to move her into the downstairs room so she wouldn't have to climb stairs anymore. We hired a part-time nurse to help in the mornings, and in the evenings I took care of everything. Changing sheets, feeding her, doing massages. It wasn't a burden. I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it out of love. One evening, after Cora had gone to bed, Margaret and I were sitting in the kitchen. She was silent for a long time, then suddenly said, "There's something I want you to know." I tensed, thinking it would be about pain or medication again. But she looked at me very seriously and quietly added, "I changed my will." I didn't say anything. I just listened. It turned out she had made the changes right after Edward left. The house we lived in would go to Cora. Most of her savings were placed in a trust for me to manage until Cora turned 18. Several family heirlooms, jewelry, a china set, a vintage locket passed down through generations, would be mine. Edward, on the other hand, would only get his father's old painting collection and a car he hadn't driven in years. I was stunned. Part of me felt honored and deeply moved. Another part, scared. I started telling her maybe we should rethink it, include Haley and the baby. I said I held no grudge. But Margaret just shook her head. "I've thought it through. This isn't revenge. It's justice. He chose who his family is." The next day, she gave me an envelope, told me not to open it until after she was gone. I put it in a drawer with the rest of her documents and tried not to think about it. Everything about it felt so final. I didn't want her to die. I didn't want to be the one trusted with her last words. But deep inside, I knew she could feel her time was short. And she was doing everything she could to make sure Cora and I had something to protect us. A few weeks later, she began having breathing problems. We called doctors, drove to the hospital, and I prayed it was something temporary. Cora grew quieter. She knew something wasn't right with Grandma, and I was just scared. And slowly I realized that when the truth came out, I would be the one who had to take the hit. I never thought I'd be the one to call Edward. After everything he'd done, after all the silence he left behind, it felt almost like betraying myself. But I didn't see any other choice. Margaret was struggling to breathe more often, growing weaker by the day, barely getting out of bed. And it felt deeply wrong that she might pass away without seeing her son one last time. I paced the room for a long time before I finally dialed his number. He answered with irritation in his voice, like I was bothering him with something trivial. I kept my tone calm, explained that Margaret's condition had worsened, that the doctors didn't have hope. I asked him to visit, not for me, but for her. He paused, then replied curtly, "I'll think about it." That was the end of the call. 2 days later, he showed up, but not alone. Haley came with him, and their son. I hadn't expected that. No warning, no heads up. I opened the door and saw the three of them standing there like they'd come for a polite visit, not to the home of a dying woman. I said nothing. I let them in, because I had promised Margaret there would be no drama. She lay in the bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale, her eyes dull. When they walked in, she barely lifted her head. The silence between her and Edward stretched long and heavy, filled with everything they never said. He sat beside her and mumbled something. She only nodded. It wasn't a real conversation. It felt formal, cold, like he was there out of obligation, not love. I was about to leave the room when I saw Cora peeking through the door. She was staring at her father, someone she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years, and he didn't even glance at her. Not a word, not a smile, as if she didn't exist. I hugged her and led her to the kitchen. Through the window, I saw Haley step out into the yard. She took out her phone and made a call. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the window was slightly open and her voice carried too easily. "Yeah, we came, just for appearances," she said with a laugh. "He says his mom's leaving him everything, so the house is basically ours." She laughed again. "I've already planned how we'll redo everything. The interior's awful. I'll get rid of all those photos of Claire and that kid. We'll start fresh." I froze. My heart pounded. She kept talking. "I know exactly what color the walls should be. Everything's going to be ours. As soon as it's all official, I'm tossing that old junk and starting from scratch." I stepped away from the window, sat down, took a deep breath. My mind was spinning. I wanted to go out there and tell her everything I thought. But I remembered my promise to Margaret, to stay calm, to keep the peace. So I stayed silent. For her. When they finally left, I returned to Margaret's room. Her eyes were closed. She looked peaceful, like nothing had happened. I sat beside her and took her hand. I hoped she hadn't seen or felt how cold and distant their visit had been. The next day, things got worse. The doctor said there was almost no time left. I stayed by her side every minute. Cora brought her water, drew pictures for her. We both did our best. 2 days later, she was gone. I remember that night in painful detail. The smell of the room, the sound of the monitor, how her breathing simply stopped, how the warmth left her body. Then came the funeral. Edward didn't help with the arrangements. None of the relatives offered. My parents and I handled everything. I chose the casket, picked out the dress she'd asked to be buried in. I wrote the farewell speech. I cried. A lot. Not from anger, from grief. After the funeral, I came home. The house was silent, empty. I sat in the kitchen when the phone rang. Margaret's lawyer asked me to come in. He would read the will the next day. My chest tightened. I didn't know what to expect. I just hoped I'd be strong enough to face it. The next day, I went to Margaret's lawyer's office. The sky was overcast, gray. It felt like even the weather understood what was about to happen. I stepped into a small room with wooden furniture, vintage chairs, and the faint scent of old paper. Mr. Hayward, the lawyer who had worked with Margaret for the last 10 years, greeted me. He invited me to sit, laid out the documents, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. I sat quietly, trying to steady my breath. As he started reading the will, my fingers were trembling. I held myself together with all I had. The will was simple, but direct. The house was left entirely to Cora with the words, "In honor of the love and care she gave me, even at her young age." The funds in Margaret's accounts were to be placed in a trust under my name until Cora came of age. If anything happened to me, access to that trust would pass to my parents. Personally, Margaret left me everything that had meant something to her. Family jewelry, an antique brooch, her porcelain tea set, letters from her own mother, and a locket passed down through generations. I fought back tears. At the very end, she wrote that she wished for me not to share this inheritance with those who forgot what it means to be family or to show compassion. This wasn't revenge. It was a choice, an intentional one. Edward was left with his father's old paintings and a car he hadn't driven in years. No mention of Haley. Not a word about their son. As I walked out of that office, my chest filled with strange emotions. On one hand, calm. I knew it had been Margaret's decision, her will. On the other, unease. I could feel something worse coming, because now they would find out. 2 days later, there was a knock at the door. I already knew who it was. I opened it, and there stood Edward, Haley, their son, and 3 relatives I hadn't seen in over a year. Their faces were grim. My stomach clenched. I let them in silently. The air thickened instantly, heavy like a storm about to break. Edward started first. His voice was sharp, angry, trembling with tension. "Why did everything go to you? The house? The money? The heirlooms? That should have gone to me. To my son." I stared at him and said nothing. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. He raised his voice. "You manipulated her when she was already sick. You knew how to convince her. It's not fair." I responded calmly but firmly. All documents had been finalized long before her condition turned critical. The dates, signatures, notaries, everything was legal. It had been entirely her decision. Haley snapped. "Why did your daughter get everything and my son nothing? He was her grandson too." I looked at her. I hadn't planned to speak up, but I couldn't hold it in. I said, "I heard your phone call that day. How you laughed at her illness. How you planned to throw away every photo and repaint the walls. You never cared to understand her. To you, this house was just a property to flip." Haley flared up. "That's a lie. You're making this up." But her eyes darted. The others glanced at each other. One of Edward's uncles turned to me and said, "But we're family too. We deserve a share. Sell the house. Be fair." For the first time in a long while, I felt real anger. Hot and sharp. I stood up and said, "None of you called her. None of you visited. She died in my arms. I washed her clothes, fed her by hand. You didn't even show up at her funeral like family, just as spectators. And now you demand something?" They went silent. Edward clenched his fists. "This is my childhood home. I'll take you to court." I laughed, without joy. "Go ahead. Her lawyer said the will is airtight. You'll get nothing. When I begged you to come see her, you didn't care. It's too late now." They left, loudly, with threats. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Once the door closed, I opened the drawer where I had kept the envelope Margaret had given me before she died. Inside was a note, her handwriting shaky, the letters uneven, but the message was clear. "Claire, you are my family. Don't give them anything. I know they'll come, but you earned this. They did not." I read it several times, and for the first time in ages, I felt like I wasn't alone. A few days passed after that confrontation, and I hoped it was finally over. I was wrong. My phone started ringing more often. The numbers weren't saved, but I had a feeling who they were. I didn't pick up, didn't reply to the texts. I was tired of being on the defensive, tired of explaining what should have been obvious. I didn't owe anyone anything. But one day, the call came from a regular, unmarked number. I was at work, sorting through reports, and out of habit, I answered without checking the screen. I recognized the voice instantly. It was Haley. Sharp, irritated, trying to sound calm, but the bitterness seeped through every word. "You know this isn't yours," she said. "You just got close at the right moment. But let's be honest, this should have been ours." I tried to interrupt her, told her the will was legal, that everything had been decided by Margaret, and that I didn't want to have this kind of conversation. But Haley kept going. The more she spoke, the more aggressive she became. "You think you're clever? That you planned this all out?" She snapped. "You just grabbed everything while we weren't watching. But this isn't over." Then she crossed a line. Her voice turned cold. "If you don't share, I'll tell Cora the truth. I'll tell her what kind of person you really are. That even her own father didn't want her. What do you think she'll believe when she's older and starts asking questions?" This wasn't just pressure anymore. It was a threat. I felt my stomach tighten, but my voice stayed firm. "If you come anywhere near my daughter, I'll go straight to the police," I said. "And by the way, this call is being recorded. I'm sure your employer would love to hear how you spend your workday." There was a pause. Then, dial tone. I messaged Margaret's lawyer right away and told him what had happened. He assured me I had every right to file a report and that he could help with a restraining order if needed. But I wasn't ready to escalate things that far. Not yet. I called Edward. I needed to know if he was involved. He picked up quickly. His voice was tense. "She threatened my daughter. Did you know?" He was silent, then let out a breath. "No. I'm sorry. I didn't know what she said. I'll talk to her." "Don't talk," I said. "Just stay away. I don't owe you anything." He tried to say something else, but I ended the call. After that, my phone went quiet. No more calls, no more texts. But I knew. It wasn't over. I knew them both too well to believe they were done. I started gathering documents just in case. I asked the lawyer to send me copies of the will, the property appraisals, all the paperwork tied to the inheritance. I didn't want a single thing out of place. At night, I'd wake up with anxiety. I had nightmares. Haley showing up at Cora's school, whispering things to her. Edward taking me to court. Us standing face to face again. It all played like a loop. But each morning I reminded myself, I wasn't defending money or a house. I was protecting my daughter, her peace, her future, the gift Margaret had given her. I often sat in the living room where Margaret used to spend her evenings. Everything was still just as she'd left it. The curtains, the old armchair, the stack of magazines. I hadn't taken down the photos, hadn't changed the rugs or repainted the walls. I wasn't keeping the house for myself. I was keeping it for what it represented. One day, I placed the locket Margaret had given me into a glass box and set it on the mantel. I knew I'd give it to Cora one day, but only when she was ready to understand what it truly meant. Since then, I've been more careful with every step. I stopped answering unknown numbers, installed a security camera by the front door, notified the school that only I or my parents could pick Cora up. This was a new chapter, not of battle, but of defense. I wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't going to live in fear. Cora and I moved into Margaret's house 2 months after the funeral. I had delayed the decision, not because I was unsure, but because I was scared. The house still carried her presence. I was afraid of feeling her too closely, and at the same time, afraid of losing her completely. But one morning, I woke up and realized it was time. Not because it got easier, but because we had to keep living. The move wasn't easy. Every room held memories, scents, voices, shadows. Cora was thrilled. For her, it was a real home, a garden, her own room, a tree for hanging a swing. And I, each night, stood by the kitchen window expecting to hear Margaret's footsteps, or her voice calling me in for tea. I hadn't touched any of her things. Her blanket was still draped over the chair. Her notebook sat on the table. Her favorite cup remained in the cupboard. I kept everything exactly as it was. Sacred. Life slowly settled into a rhythm. I worked remotely. Cora went to school, and in the evenings we cooked or watched movies together. Sometimes it felt like things were stabilizing, that the storm had passed. But it was a false calm. One morning I received an email, a legal notice. I recognized the sender immediately, Edward's attorney. He was filing a lawsuit, requesting a revision of the will, claiming that Margaret had been under my influence in a vulnerable state, and that her decisions might have been coerced. The letter also asked for the assets to be frozen pending investigation. I clenched the paper in my hands. My throat went dry. Everything I had feared, everything I'd been warned about, was now real. I called my lawyer immediately. He was calm, said this was a typical intimidation tactic. The will was airtight, signed 2 years before her death, in full clarity of mind with 2 notaries present. But now we'd face bureaucracy, court, documents, hearings, stress, and most of all, Cora. I was terrified it would affect her, that they'd pull her into something she had nothing to do with. I started preparing paperwork, gathered statements from the nurse, the doctor, witnesses who saw Margaret making decisions independently. Letters, dates, records, photos, all sorted into labeled folders. Edward and Haley didn't call again. They were putting their faith in the court system. I knew this wasn't about money. It was about power, about punishing me, about trying to make me retreat. Those weeks, I became quieter. I didn't even tell my parents what was happening. I didn't want them to worry. Inside me, something solid was forming. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. I had to see this through. One night, Cora asked me, "Mom, why are you always sad?" I looked at her. Her eyes were just like Margaret's. Gentle, observant. "Just tired," I said. She hugged me, quietly. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't have the right to give up. A week later, I received a notice with the date for the preliminary hearing. I was required to attend in person. I took a day off work, put on the dress Margaret once said made me look truly strong, and went to court. I wasn't afraid. My lawyer was beside me. Her voice echoed in my mind. In my bag, I carried that locket. The courtroom was nearly empty, just us and the attorneys. Edward sat across from me, avoiding eye contact. Haley was there too, confident, smug, as if everything had already been decided. The judge asked questions, standard ones, calmly. I answered clearly, without embellishment. I didn't need to prove anything. I was simply defending the wishes of the woman who had believed in me more than anyone ever had. When it ended, I stepped outside and inhaled the cold air. It was quiet. I didn't know how long this would go on, or how much strength it would take. But I was ready. The initial hearings didn't lead to a resolution. Everything was postponed. The judge requested additional documents, witness statements, and another review of the will. I knew the process would drag on. Months, maybe a year. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Something had shifted in me. I wasn't just defending, I was moving forward, intentionally. Edward and Haley didn't show up at the house, didn't call, didn't write. Everything was filtered through lawyers, requests, letters, formal notices. I responded promptly, clearly, hired an accountant, prepared power of attorney forms, submitted what was needed. Their last names in my inbox no longer made my hands tremble. But inside, the weight of it all slowly wore me down. I noticed I stopped enjoying simple things. Breakfast with Cora became routine. Smiling at her drawings felt forced. I tried to hide it, but children notice. She often began with, "Mom, when will it all be over?" And I had no answer. In the evenings, I'd open the box of Margaret's belongings. Notes, recipes, little scraps of handwriting that smelled like home. Like safety. I missed her. Not just as a person, but as a foundation. She had held me together, believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. One day, I stumbled upon a small journal of hers. Very personal. On the last few pages, her handwriting. Shaky. Delicate. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I knew they would come. I knew they'd be angry. But I did the right thing. Claire is not just my son's ex-wife. She's the one who stayed when things were hard. She never asked for anything, but gave me the most precious gift. A sense of purpose. This house is her home now. That locket is her protection. I believe she will make it through. And if one day she's scared, I hope she opens this and remembers, I chose her. Deliberately. With love, I sat holding that page for a long time. And then I cried. Really cried. Not from pain, not from anger or exhaustion. But because all this time I'd been holding myself together, trying to be strong, independent, but inside, I was still just a girl who needed someone to say, "You're not alone." That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, thinking about how much damage comes from people who once promised love. And how sometimes a heart that was once a stranger becomes the only one that truly feels like home. The next day, I picked Cora up early from school. We went to the park. I bought her hot chocolate and ice cream. We sat on a bench and she asked, "Can this house always be ours? Like, forever?" I smiled. Not sadly, but truly. Yes, it will be, always. That evening, I wrote a letter to my lawyer. I asked him not just to continue defending the inheritance, but to file a counterclaim for emotional distress, attempted manipulation, and harassment. I no longer wanted to just endure. I wanted to draw the line. That night, I slept peacefully. No anxiety, no dreams. And in the morning, for the first time in what felt like ages, I woke up feeling like I could breathe again. A little over 2 months had passed since the last hearing. The case was officially closed. The court upheld the will, declared it valid, written in full clarity, without coercion. Edward's claims were dismissed as groundless. My countersuit was partially upheld. They got nothing, and they couldn't touch anything again. I read the court's decision in silence, sitting on the porch. Cora was curled up next to me, sketching something, while I just watched the garden. The flower beds, the apple tree, the old bench. Everything was still the same. But inside me, the tension was gone. Only steady, heavy, calm breathing remained. I had made it through. We had made it through. There was no euphoric sense of victory. I didn't feel triumphant. Just silence. A tired, mature silence. Like everything inside me had finally settled into place. A week later, a letter from Edward arrived. A physical letter, handwritten. He apologized, not for the affair, not for disappearing, but for everything that happened. For the lawsuit, the pressure, for Haley. He wrote that he hadn't realized how far things had gone, that he didn't know how to stop, that he was angry, not at me, but at himself, at his mother, at the past. He asked for forgiveness, without any request to get anything back, without conditions, just a letter. I put it in a drawer. I didn't respond, and I didn't plan to. Sometimes silence is the best reply. Haley never showed up again. No calls, no messages. Maybe she realized she'd gone too far. Maybe she just lost interest. I didn't care. What mattered was that they were no longer part of our lives. Cora and I lived in the house as if it had always been ours. I did a bit of remodeling in her room, bought new furniture. Everything else, I left untouched. I didn't want to erase Margaret. I wanted her to stay with us. In the lamp's glow, in the creaky floorboards, in the old china. Cora grew calm and confident. She talked about her grandma often, drew pictures of her. Sometimes she'd say, "I feel like she's watching us." And I would nod. I felt it too. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd light a candle near the fireplace. Beside it was the little box with the locket. I didn't open it. I just sat nearby. Not because I was sad, but because I wanted to feel that it had all meant something. I didn't become rich. I didn't start a brand new life. I simply continued the old one, but on my own terms. Without fear, without persuasion, without anyone else's control. Now I knew. Family isn't just who you're born to. It's who stays, who stands beside you when everyone else walks away, who takes your hand, not out of duty, but because they can't imagine doing otherwise. Margaret wasn't my mother, but she became one, and I'll carry that with me forever.